Forge, Chapter 36. When I woke, the clouds were scurrying to cover the late afternoon sun. The food and the sleep had drained the befuddlement from my head. It hurt some when I stood up, but I could see that clear and think clear. A stocky lad carrying a jar and a dirty polishing rag entered the kitchen of Moore Hall. He was taller than me, but not too many years older. His eyes were set far apart from each other and bulged a bit like a frog's. His shoes were polished, both the leather and the fat pewter buckles. Spotless white stockings fit tight to his calves. His breeches were black wool and appeared tailored to his form. He wore a tobacco-colored waistcoat over a linen shirt as white as snow, and the sleeves rolled up so that he might work without making it dirty. Had his skin been white, I would have figured him for a manservant, working for one of the congressmen, and as his skin was as dark as mine, it was more likely that he was a slave. "Your master will see you now," he said. The request was not long enough for me to reckon where he came from. New England, the South, the Middle States, or across the ocean. "My name is Curzon. You?" He moved the wooden box on the shelf to the side. "How did you come to be here?" I asked. He placed the jar on the high shelf. "I was sent to fetch you, not to stand about jawing." "Who is your master?" He folded the rag and set it aside the jar. "You will follow me." He led me to the dining room, converted to be a useful place for the men of Congress. Mirrors were hung opposite of the windows to strengthen the last rays of the sun. Dim portraits glared down from the walls, lit by guttering candles and wax-covered sconces. The long table was completely covered with books, half-burnt candlesticks, hills of papers, and an enormous map. I could not read the words on top of the papers, but I could recognize numbers, long columns of numbers that were added up to great sums. The room was cold, the fire dying. Bellingham sat at the far end of the table. "Ah," he said, looking up from his papers. "Resurrected at last. Fetch some wood for the fire. Gideon, the maid, has neglected it again." Gideon was this fellow's name. He nodded and gave a courteous "sir" before gliding through the door and closing it behind him without a sound. Bellingham set down his pen and waved me closer. "Let me see what damage the buffoon did to your pate." I walked the length of the table, bent at the waist so he could peer at my head, and then stood again. "You'll heal. It's not deep." I said nothing. He sat back in his chair and sighed. "This is for the best. You'll see that in time." I stared, imagining his wrists in shackles, a noose lowered over his head, kicking away the stool that he stood upon, the sound of the rope that it would make when his neck snapped. "We're crowded here. But it's better than that frozen hovel on the hill. You'll have decent clothes and food." He waited for a reply, but still I said nothing. Any words I spoke were surely earned me a fierce beating. I did not yet have control of my mouth or my temper. The silence of the room was broken by Gideon, who was entering carrying a scant armful of wood. He deposited it by the hearth and knelt to revive the fire, but Bellingham waved him away. "Leave that," Bellingham said. "Remind the cook that the gentlemen will be hungry when they arrive, and that we ought to heat up some wash water for Curzon, and send the maid in." Gideon stood and inclined his head. "Yes, sir." Bellingham waited until Gideon had again disappeared, then stretched his arms above his head once and yawned. "The maid takes care of the mending and washing, and whatever else is needed." My mouth remained locked. I could not be goaded into a conversation with him, to act as if we were all well and natural. "Gideon is on loan to the committee from one of the congressmen in New York. He has struggled to properly serve all the five of us. Your help will be most welcome. He'll show you the lay of the house and explain our routines. It will be much like our time in New York, only with more coats to brush and more boots to clean." He speared a cold potato with his fork and bit into it. "Where is that blasted girl? Would you attend to the fire, Curzon? If we wait for her to do it, we'll surely freeze." I crossed the hearth and picked up the fire poker. A length of iron was as thick as 2 fingers and as long as my arm. I could crack his skull with one hard blow, but I was still barefooted and half-starved. Even if I outran the guards, I'd perish of the cold. I had to soldier my temper, for now. I knelt and poked at the dying coals. I function as an aide to the committee from Congress, Bellingham said proudly, as if I inquired about his position. It was a stroke of genius to become as close as I did to Morris those last months in New York. You'll remember him. Young chap, flirts shamelessly, rich as Medeas. Serve him first, always, then Reed, for he has the ear of the General Washington, and then me. The other two fellows are good enough, but they can't help my plans. I arranged the wood above the coals in a crisscross fashion. Morris has hinted I might be appointed to head of the commissary on account of my mercantile experience. At the very least, I ought to become a person of rank within one of the divisions responsible for supplying the army. I need your ears again, Curzon. Listen in on any and all conversations, particularly when Morris and Reed meet with anyone in the headquarters. I ignored him and blew on the coals to revive them. A few weeks was all I needed. In that time, I'd learned the habits of the gentleman, who was tidy, who was forgetful, who carried coin upon his person, and who left it in his chamber. I did everything I could to strengthen myself for escape. When the right moment presented itself, I'd know who to steal from, how, and in which direction to flee. The coals glowed red. There was a quiet knock at the door. "Enter," Bellingham said. The door opened. "The maid, sir," Gideon announced. "Perfect. That's all, Gideon." I blew again as the maid stepped softly across the floor. I would not alert Gideon to my plan. There was something about his manner I did not trust. Sparks finally popped. Bellingham continued conversating with himself. Morris arranged my position, assisting the Congress, he chuckled. Had 2 rooms all to myself near the city tavern, far nicer than his. I bought a sturdy mare for £15, and this girl for 10. The coals burst into flame. "Oh, do stand up, Curzon. I can hardly introduce you to her backside, can I?" I stood, brushing the ashes from the wood grift on my hands. Time stopped. The room was so still. I could hear voices arguing in the kitchen, heavy footsteps on the floor above, the crackle of the fire eating wood, horses approaching in the camp road. I recognized her right away, of course. Bellingham reached for the last potato. The tines of his fork screeched wickedly across a plate. "She tried to help us nab Lockton in his foul nest of traitors. Remember? No, 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 no." Candlelight caught the rage in her eyes, reflected off the scar on her cheek. 'Twas Isabel.